So one of the things that's fun about this conversation, particularly tonight, is because Sarah and I agree on many things, but we also disagree on many things. So this will be actually a really fun conversation where we can both challenge each other and actually challenge you on some of these ideas that we have, long-holding. Some of us share and some of us don't, and that is the diversity that is in our society. There's, as Ricardo had mentioned, this is a sleeping giant in our midst, both with the resources and the impact it has on our lives. The prison industrial complex, one might say. So, but I wanted to get started really by sharing a little bit about Sarah. Actually, having Sarah a little about yourself, your passion. How'd you get into this? And we'll start there, and then we'll get on to some other things.
Well, I think, so first of all, I'm from Zambia. I'm always identified as African American. I have one black father and white father, and I only just say this to contextualize what I'm about to say, which is, like many good students of color, I went to Carleton College, and I was interested in addressing, inequality, specifically around race and class. And I was actually reading an academic paper by Orlando Patterson, and it was talking about the definition of slavery. And he defined slavery because, well, if you don't know this, apparently there's no agreement on the definition of what slavery means. And he defined it in three ways. He said it was natal alienation, violent subordination, and general dishonorment. And I wrote a paper disagreeing, saying that this was an invalid definition of slavery because it would actually include the prison population and the African American population in today's context. And basically since that moment, I have never really done anything else. And it's primarily because what became clear to me at that moment is that our justice system and our prisons have become the nexus of all social inequality. And anyone who's heard me talk about this has heard me say that. And I say that because it's where you end up when you can't get mental health treatment, when you have inadequate education. It's where when you can't find a job or find housing. So it's basically become the nexus of all of the social inequalities that have been in our system. So after Carleton, I went to New York and set up reentry programs for the Center for Court Innovation, which started community courts. And then I worked on ending the juvenile death penalty, which the Supreme Court ended. They ruled it unconstitutional. And then I came here to do my doctoral work, and probably like many good advocates, I am all but dissertation, or ABD, because I couldn't stop doing the actual practical application of political and social realities. And so while I was in graduate school, someone from Mark's organization called me up and said they needed a director to do some research consulting on racial disparities in the justice system, and I did that, and it fully embedded me in the community here, and I haven't looked back. I currently am the Chief Operating Officer at 180 Degrees, and we've been around for 40 years. We're a direct service agency. Amongst the many things we do is we serve about 4,500 youth and adults involved in the justice system today. But we started as a halfway house, so we serve all of the serious violent offenders returning to Hennepin, Anoka, and Dakota County in our halfway house. And to give a context about why this is so important to me is because the guys who are coming out of prison and referred to our halfway house, they are given 30 days to find a job and 60 days to find housing, often after 10, 15 years of a prison sentence. And I'm not saying that they should receive special consideration, but they do deserve a fair opportunity for employment. And we just need to make sure that our policies are supporting the actual work that our nonprofit partners trying to serve this population are trying to do. In the 1970s, our prison population has gone through a rapid expansion. And Minnesota is actually a little unique. When you hear about data for the justice system, the first thing to remember is that there's different components. And so there's front-end issues and there's back-end issues. But basically in Minnesota, we actually have one of the smallest prison populations in the nation. We're I think the second smallest. And that's because, though, we use probation very liberally. But so the net result is we have the fourth highest rate of people on probation in the entire nation. 1 in 26 Minnesotans is on some form of correctional supervision on any given day. And so that's not including, so think about it, 1 in 26 Minnesotans. That means, probably 1 or 2 people here are on correctional supervision. And in addition, we've also had one of the highest racial disparities in our justice system. We have the highest racial disparity in our juvenile justice system. On a given day in Ramsey County, Hennepin, or Dakota, 85% of the youth who are detained are youth of color. And then in addition, there's many things that we have called collateral consequences, which are the barriers that are produced once you have a criminal record, whether or not you've been to prison or not. And so once you have a criminal record, it becomes more difficult to find employment and housing, which then feeds this cycle of recidivism or reoffending. Because if you don't have employment, you can't find a house, what else are you going to do? And due to the, some of the most recent data suggests that 1 in 5 people in the nation have some form of a criminal record. And that includes from that could be just an arrest record, but why that's significant is that many employers, when they're looking at your criminal background, don't know how to identify the difference between an arrest record, a misdemeanor and a felony, a dismissal. And so these things are impacting employment opportunities, and they're compounding the already the condensation of urban issues and also rural poverty issues.
Let's just kind of talk about what we mean by racial disparities, how you define that term since you're using it, and then, why do you think that exists here in Minnesota particularly? And until then, what? And then we'll talk a little bit later about what we're going to do about these things and what you guys are doing about them, but I think it'll be an interesting way to go.
Sure. So first of all, racial disparities just means there's a disproportionate amount of people of color who are involved in the system relative to their total number in the population. So about the total percentage of African Americans or black people in Minnesota is about 5%. And in fact, it's 230,000 the last time I checked. And of those, 50,000 are African immigrants. So what it means is disproportionate to their actual population, they are overrepresented in the justice system. And I actually think this is actually really important because I always try to stress, don't talk about the national issues, talk about the state issues. Because the majority of people who are in prison, it's based on state law and state policies. The federal prison population is very small. And Minnesota is actually, again, unique. And I say this because we actually don't, the majority of people in prison in Minnesota are actually not people of color. Even though they're hugely disproportionate, it's still not the majority. So about 70% of the people with convicted felon who have a felony conviction actually are from greater Minnesota and are most likely white. And so there's some difficulties this presents for people who want to advocate for the issue. Because one, we want to address the racial disparities, but at the same time, we don't want to feed into the stereotype that all crime is done by people of color. And the other thing is, on a political level, the reality is in Minnesota, the majority of people who are our political representatives are not from the urban areas. So the urban legislators tend to agree with us on our ideas for reform. But we need to convince the legislators and politicians from greater Minnesota that these issues are relevant to them. And I think everyone's probably heard about the crystal meth epidemic, and this is one of those opportunities that's been, it's not great, but it's still an opportunity to sort of allow greater Minnesota legislators to have a way to relate to these issues. So I think it's really important. And the other thing is that urban and rural issues, in my opinion, need to start working more closely together. Because they're, in fact, while there's issues in terms of how services are delivered, the fundamental issues aren't the same. It's still about jobs, it's still about lack of access to services. And so I personally am a big advocate for bridging the urban-rural divide and beginning to work on these issues. And I think the best way to approach it is on issue areas. And I think criminal justice reform presents a really huge opportunity. And I say this because, and part of the thing is this is one of the things that happens in movement. I think there's things called windows of opportunity. And because of the expansion of the justice system, there is not an area I can think of in social service in life that is not impacted by the justice system. I mentioned housing and jobs, but mental health services. So if you're a mental health practitioner, you now are having to deal with people with criminal records and how that impacts services and availability of services. If you work in education, in Hennepin and Ramsey County, 25% of the school referrals for detention were coming directly from the schools. So there isn't any longer an area. So basically, and what we know now about working on issues, especially in a divided government with huge bipartisan, partisan gridlock, is that the way to have success is actually to broaden the coalition. So we stay very focused on the issues that brought us at the table, and we try not to deviate from them. We work on issues that are, help people who have become involved in the criminal justice system become successful in their lives. But I think the other thing is we also decided that we won't actual lobby for money. One of the things, if you are involved in the nonprofit community, is one of the things that I think breaks apart coalitions more than anything is competition for scarce resources. So nonprofits, and if you don't know this, believe me, it's true, they compete fiercely for attention because it brings them resources. And so we just made a decision that we were always going to talk about it in terms of the coalition and not in terms of one agency, and that we wouldn't advocate for money. And so that allows us to just focus on policy. So anything that happens or anything that happens in the coalition, we all equally benefit from because it benefits our clients. So I would say that's one thing. So just maintaining a broad coalition. Today we have, I think, 56 organizational members, tons of individuals. But they range from NAMI, Minnesota, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, to the Catholic Conference, to a group called the R3 Collaborative, which is, I would say, a more conservative evangelical group that works on prison ministries and recovery issues. I would say all the major service providers who deal with reentry, the Children's Defense Fund, the state public defenders, in fact, the Minnesota Community Corrections Association, they see the need for this and they support us both financially and in they're willing to sign on and say they're a supporter. So I think the one thing is being broad about the coalition and being focused in your goals. Coalitions have a tendency to, I think, get distracted by tangential issues.